All right. So we just ended with this image right here. At this point, I want you to open up a second window and just pause me for a second. And I want you to go to YouTube and I want you to type in "Brother, can you spare a dime?" And there should be the first thing that pops up. It doesn't necessarily have to look exactly like mine. It should be, 3 or 4 minutes long. This one's 3 minutes and 11 seconds. I want you to listen to at least the first minute, minute and a half of this song. This comes out during the Great Depression, and I think it does a pretty good job summing up the emotions that Americans had, especially when you reference the American dream on how you're supposed to be able to come here. This is supposed to be the country of hope. And when you look at what happens to Americans during the Depression, that's obviously not what happened. So I'm not going to play it. Just pause me for a second, go to YouTube, and listen to this. And when you're done with, we're listening to a minute, minute and a half or so, come back and unpause me. All right, so we said 25% of the population is homeless. We said amongst the African American community, you're sitting at 50%, over 50%, but we'll just go ahead and say 50% of the African American community was homeless. So what happens is all these people lose their jobs and they lose their paychecks and they lose their homes. They end up living in this. Um, they lived in empty railroad cars. They lived in cardboard boxes, shacks, scrap metal, anything they could find to turn into a home. Now, some of them are obviously a little bit better put together, like this one right here, versus this one over here. But it was literally anything they could find, they turned into four walls and a roof to protect them from the elements. And these became known as Hoovervilles. And they popped up all over the country and they were mocking President Hoover for his lack of involvement in assisting the people to improve the conditions of the country. And so Hoover, President of the United States, gets mocked by this and his lack of involvement. They mocked him in many other ways. You had Hoover flags, which were people's pockets. They pull your pocket out and waved um, in the breeze, and so it was symbolizing the fact that they were poor; they didn't have anything. You had Hoover blankets, which were newspapers. You had Hoover heaters, which were the campfires that they put in these communities to stay warm. And so all of these things are an attempt to make fun of the president of the United States. So I don't really think that he had any chance at reelection in 1932. So here's some pictures illustrating for you outside the Hooverville. And they're sitting down on a box reading a speech by Hoover, and that eventually would become a Hoover blanket, keep them warm. And then this one right here, this guy's a victim of bank failure. And a little squirrel comes over and says, "But why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good?" And he said, "I did." So he's obviously a gentleman that lost everything thanks to the banks failing. So you would think that things couldn't get any worse than the 1930s from the Great Depression. Unfortunately, they could. Between 1930 and 1934, nearly 1 million farmers lost their farms due to finances. The remaining farmers on the Great Plains suffered a terrible drought, which led to the Dust Bowl. Dust storms destroyed millions of acres of farmland. We learned back in the Middle Ages that you should practice something called crop rotation. And for whatever reason, we forgot that. So in the plains, and when we talk about the plains, we're mainly talking about this area of the country right here. The plains was where a good portion of farming took place. It was usually referred to as the Great American Desert because it was flat. And so um, they just produced and they produced and they produced and they produced, especially during World War One, of course, and then into the 1920s, overproduction. We talked about all that already. So they just kept producing. And if you continue to work and work and work and work and work, eventually you're going to be worn out if you never take any time off. Same thing happens with the soil. If you continue to harvest and harvest and harvest and you're pulling the nutrients out of the soil, eventually the land is going to be tired. It's going to be brittle. It's going to be dry. And especially in this part of the country right here, there is a very, very large disparity between the need for rain and what they actually get for rain. So, um, combine the overproduction, the lack of crop rotation, and the lack of rain, a drought, and it's the perfect storm for what occurred, the Dust Bowl. So this is also an extremely windy part of the country. So you have winds of 70, 80 miles an hour. They come and pick up this very brittle, dry soil, and they take it. And that's really what the Dust Bowl is about. And the Dust Bowl and some of these storms that occurred were so severe that there were there was sand storms that had made it their way all the way to New York City, way over here. It's not on the map, but it happened a few times where these storms made their way all the way to the East Coast. And here's what some of those storms looked like. It looks like a giant thunderstorm that is, or I don't know, a volcano erupt. It's unreal. This is in Dodge City, Kansas, and I can't imagine seeing something like this coming. Some of these storms could reach roughly 8,000 feet high and could travel in some cases 100 miles an hour. So the storms that were displaced, the storms displaced throughout the 1930 and 1934 period, it displaced, meaning moved twice as much dirt than what was moved to create and build the Panama Canal. So that gives you a little bit of perspective there, because you dug down into the water. They got rid of the land completely to create the Panama Canal, and it displaced twice as much as that building. And then here's another storm as well. So you had to travel with what basically looked like gas masks to protect yourself. If you get caught in some of these storms, sometimes, especially children, they ended up dead because they're inhaling the storm. And something that's really neat that comes from this, if your parents are a little bit older, if you spend time with your grandparents, and people set the table and they set it in advance, a lot of the times they do what with the cup? They set it upside down. The reason that they do that is it goes back to the Dust Bowl, where people would turn the cups upside down. They'd actually turn their plates and everything else upside down too, but we just kind of keep the idea of the cup. And it was so dust wouldn't get in. And that's kind of the same principle we do now, but obviously we don't have to worry about storms like this. So I think that's kind of a neat aspect of the story, a tradition that kind of still stays with us. So family life is going to be hurt during the Depression. We talked about that already. The fact that those who still had jobs lived in fear that their next paycheck would be their last. Those who were still working felt guilty. The American birth rate fell to the lowest level on record because people realized that one, they couldn't afford a child, and two, they didn't have the means to take care of it. And then some teens are going to run away and families broke up. Men who couldn't find work often felt like they had betrayed their families. We still kind of have this idea, even though a lot of both parents work, we still have this concept that it's the man's job to provide for the family. I definitely still feel that burden, even though my wife works as well. And I think most men feel like it is their job to provide. It's their duty. But I want to give you a little bit of perspective here on how bad the economy got, especially for farmers, going a little bit backwards to the Dust Bowl. In 1919, a bushel of wheat sold for $2.16. 1919. In 1932, so we're in the middle of the beginning, I guess you could say, of the Great Depression, sold for 38 cents. That is a decrease of almost $2. And $2 to us now is chunk change, but um, $2 back then, I mean, that's what I mean. That's half of what the people who worked at Ford made in a day. So $2 is a good chunk of money. So just a little bit of perspective there for you. I alluded to this when we were looking at the picture, but the fact that minorities suffered even more during the Depression, even in good times, African Americans were the last hired and first fired. And as I said earlier, their unemployment rate sat at around 50%. That's a good number to hold on to. And then Okies. As Okies moved west to find work, Mexicans and Mexican Americans faced fierce competition for jobs. That's going to create some issues between white people and Mexican Americans. And it's going to, especially in California, people are going to urge local governments to repatriate Mexican Americans, which essentially means send them back to their home country. So I'm going to leave you with a quote that I think is perfect to describe the issues this is dealing with African Americans, but it could probably be easily applied to the Mexican Americans as well. So it comes from an African American, and he says, "The Depression only came when it hit the white man. We've, African Americans, been plundering for decades." So, for African Americans, for some Mexican Americans, the Depression, in some cases, was really just everyday life for them. And nobody really paid attention to the conditions that were going on in the country until it impacted the white person. Um, and we have to keep reminding ourselves that we're pre-civil rights movement here. But I think that's pretty true. If you look at all the conditions that all these minorities had to deal with, it's the white people that were doing well. I mean, you had a random guy here and there that was African American that maybe was able to climb out of the conditions, but for the most part, it was white people that did well, and they didn't really bother to pay attention to anything until their precious money was taken away from them. Then their eyes were opened up a little bit more. So that is it for this standard, this section. I'll post the rest of the stuff that you guys need to take care of before I get back on Monday to Google Classroom here shortly. Hope you guys have a great weekend.